So I'll now turn to a small thought, a little reminiscence on my part. When I first landed in JFK's Terminal 4 12 years ago, as I waited in the immigration line and scanned the walls of the cavernous hall, I was struck by an immense 28-panel painted relief. And the art installation by Deborah Masters, which is now permanent in that hall, depicts a range of scenes from New York City's 5 boroughs. There are images of garment workers and beachgoers and basketball players and fishmongers. There are images of the subway, of cyclists and skyscrapers, faces of every color, race, religion, and creed. And I was overcome by a sense of this city as I took in my first impression, the first impression that it gave to me. And before air travel became the norm, this city gave a very different first impression to its guests, because those who were visiting, arriving in New York Harbor by sea at any time over the last century, the sight that would have struck them on their arrival was the torch of freedom held aloft by Lady Liberty. For at that time, that colossal copper effigy served as this city's first impression. And this self-conscious exhibition of values and disposition is not a novel idea, because over the course of human history, states, districts, and cities have perpetually tried to present their first impressions to outsiders. Even in the realm of fiction, borders are made to leave a deliberate impression. Dante's Hell greets guests with gates that read La ciudad omne se pranza voicentinatra. And for those of you who don't speak Italian, which I'm a little disappointed in, I have to say, it means abandon all hope, ye who enter. And for those who don't speak English, it means you're in serious trouble. And it is this week, as Moshe's final speech to the people heads into its home stretch, that he expresses God's suggestion for their new home's first impression on guests. And it is not a statue or a colossus, nor a series of painted friezes, but God insists that the edge of Israel greets its guests, like Dante's gates, with an inscription. He says, "V'chatavta al ha'avanim," write on these stones at the border, et kol divrei haTorah hazot, the entirety of Scripture, be'er heitev, and write it be'er heitev. The entire Torah, it seems, is to be inscribed on stones at the perimeter of our sacred territory. We're not to project our disposition with flags or copper figures or a canvas that captures the human condition, but with the text that issues us with our mission and crystallizes God's vision for a just world. But this is my question. What does be'er heitev mean? 2 words that I did not translate. Having been told to write the words v'chatavta al ha'avanim, what does be'er heitev add? Ozcroll translates the phrase as well clarified. Write on the words of the Torah, be'er heitev, well clarified. JPS in 1917 translated it as very plainly. And JPS in 1985 translated it as most distinctly, as if there would have been a presumption on the part of the people to scribble the text of Scripture, to scrawl the words that are a picture of divinity, to turn the canon into graffiti and signal an indifference toward Revelation's legacy. So why on earth does Moshe need to stress to the people that this national first impression has to be written clearly or plainly or distinctly? And there are 3 very, very, very brief views that I wish to share with you this afternoon. First, we have Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who was one of the most prominent German Jewish scholars in the second half of the 19th century. And he implies quite simply that Moshe's instruction to inscribe the Torah be'er heitev does not suggest that the copyists would have been lazy or indolent or indifferent to the sacred script that they were transcribing. They are told to write plainly. They are told to write clearly and distinctly to correct for any perception that the Torah could have been written in an elegant calligraphy that would sacrifice access for aesthetics. In his words, Be'er Heitev, what does it mean when Moshe tells them to write Be'er Heitev? Kadesh Yuchal Kol Hadam L'Kora'ot, so that any human being could read it. And in the 19th century, Rabbi Hoffman is in an age on which suffrage is on the ascendancy, where egalitarian instincts fueled movements in search of political and social equality. And he presents our nation, Israel's first impression, as one of intellectual democracy, where the text that informs our culture can be read by every single literate citizen. Anybody crossing over the Jordan into our borders will have seen that our canon is not a code for aristocrats, but a document that is, though dictated by God, written for the people. Our sacred truths are not etched in a private cipher, but penned in an open book. There is a second view as to what Be'er Heitev means, which describes it not about access, but something entirely different. And this is the view of the greatest Jew to have ever lived, who was?
Malbim.
Malbim. Excellent. Yeah, by the end. Malbim says, Be'er Heitev does not just mean clearly legible, and it doesn't serve just to promote access to the text. For him, for Malbim, Moshe wants Israel's borders to be adorned with a text that's very lettering, embodies eternity. Now, in 1622, Camillo Baldi, we're all with the Italians today, who was an Italian scientist and philosopher, he published what is now seen as the first work to touch on the art or the science of graphology, which is the analysis of handwriting. And in that work, Camillo Baldi claims that our penmanship can reveal our character. And in that work, he condemns those who try to hide their nature behind professional writing that reveals nothing of their soul. And since Camillo Baldi, of course, the field of graphology has gone on to find applications in the realms of employment, profiling, psychotherapy, marital compatibility, criminal evidence, as I'm sure you've seen in Law and Order, and medical diagnostics, where it remains somewhat controversial. And for Malbim, what Camillo Baldi condemns in human writing is precisely what God demands in the text of our collective first impression. He demands, by saying Be'er Heitev, that it be written in a way that leaves no traces to reflect the nature or the time of the scribes. The way the Malbim puts it, B'chol Eit, at every era in history, Yishtaneh ma'at tmunat ha'otiyot, the image of the letters evolves, it changes over time. V'nikar tamid, and you can always tell when you look at a piece of script, you go up to a Geniza, you pick out a text, a document, you can tell which age, which era it's from, mitoch tmunot ha'otiyot, from the lettering. So he admits, Malbim, that the shape and the nature of the same script evolves over history, and that attentive analysts can determine when a text was written, if not precisely by whom. But a gifted scribe, the Malbim says, can hide the signs of the time. Hasofrim hamuflaim, wondrous authors, Yecholim lichtov, can write tmunot otiot, the images of the letters, in a way, velo nikar, that you cannot tell shenichtav ata, that they were written right now, but they can predate. They can forge old texts. They can write in a way that hides the time of the writing. And when God tells Moshe to tell the people to inscribe the writing of the Torah on the edge of their new land as their first impression to guests and visitors and citizens, it must be done Be'er Heitev, in a way that hides the traces of time. Because for Malbim, our collective first impression is not simply one that embodies democratic yearnings for access and equality, but is one that exhibits perpetual resonance of our Constitution, because the Torah for Malbim and our values are not a vestige of an ancient faith or a relic of a primordial age. They are a living, breathing testament to eternal meaning that our tradition carries for the human condition. So on the one side, we have Rabbi Hoffman, who sees ancient Israel's borders as etched with a unanimously accessible text. And on the other, we have Malbim, who sees our first impression as a transcendent script that hides the time of its inscription from graphologists to exhibit its interminable worth. But there is a final view, a third view that I wish to share of what Be'er Heitev mean. When God says, inscribe the text of scripture on your borders, Be'er Heitev. According to Elimelech of Lezhensk, one of the founders of a great Hasidic dynasty, he says that the spirit of our nation state's first impression on guests as they came to our border on the bank of the Jordan had nothing to do with intellectual democracy or doctrinal philosophy, and everything to do with simple human kindness. When Moshe instructs the people to inscribe the text of the Torah Be'er Heitev, it doesn't mean clearly or plainly or distinctly or legibly or professionally. It simply means Be'er Heitev, write the Torah with an explanation of why it leads to goodness. Unlike Dante's gates, which aim to intimidate or horrify hell's guests, the inscription on our border for Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk aims to assure those who come to our shores that this land and its inhabitants are driven by Tov, by a vision that seeks the good. That for all the curses that appear in its pages, the Torah seeks a world infused with peace and harmony, with kindness and compassion, a world in which human beings find healing and come together. And as I think back 12 years ago to the impact that this city's first impression had on me through its 28 panels of human faces and diversity, and I think of the extent to which God wanted our nation to craft its first impression for humanity, it behooves us to consider the first impressions that we leave on the world around us. A warm smile, one thinker once said, is the universal language of human kindness. And our sages centuries ago recognized this profound truth and suggest that our personal borders are adorned with that beaming vernacular, Mekabel et kol adam b'sefer panim yafot, to greet every human being with a gentle and warm countenance. So at this juncture, as we are now in the midst of Elul, in the midpoint in our preparation for the new year, let us try to exhibit kindness on our face to those that we meet. Let us try to showcase sympathy to those who are in need. Let us try to live lives that exemplify rigorous commitment, but one that presents our families and our friends and our neighbors with the kind of warmth and grace and patience that leaves an impression to last a lifetime. I want to wish you all a Shabbat of rest, of health, of calm, of peace, of kindness, where we only receive good impressions. It is wonderful to see your faces, and please God, I'll see many of you over Shabbat, and I'll see some of you through the week. Sunday night, we'll have our second installment of The Moral Universe. Hopefully it'll get more moral by then. I just want to wish you all a wonderful Shabbat, and to know that Rabbi Cal very briefly joins us this afternoon. It's lovely to see you. And of course, I want to wish Shabbat Shalom to everybody, to the Cohns and the Beanstalks and the Hertans and the Rosenbaums, and I see there the Bruckners and the Goldsteins and the Nissenfelds and the Wieners and the Geliebtes and the Laubers and the Lerners, and I see the Bobrows and the Zatzes. Jerry, you better get running. Shul's in about a minute. Good
Shabbos. Good Shabbos, everybody.
Jerry, Rabbi Tavo, of course.
Have a great Shabbos.
The other